Welcome to Wisdom and Blessing. This story is for you if you're tired of trying to figure everything out. It's about someone who keeps searching for the right path until rest brings clarity. While you listen, it can help ease inner tension, calm your thoughts, and let go of the pressure to always know what comes next. It's not about making a choice, but about trusting that sometimes the path appears when you stop forcing it. At the edge of the highlands, where mist lingered like an unfinished thought, a young student walked alone along a narrow path. The stones beneath his feet were smooth from centuries of passing travelers, yet his steps carried no certainty. Each morning he rose before the sun, adjusted the worn strap of his satchel, and continued forward, not because he knew where the path led, but because stopping felt unbearable. The wind moved quietly through the tall grass beside him. Birds stirred, then settled again. The world appeared calm, but inside the student, motion never ceased. He had studied under teachers whose voices were calm and whose eyes seemed to rest in distant clarity. He had memorized sayings, practiced postures, repeated questions meant to dissolve questions themselves. Still, something remained unresolved. Each lesson felt close, but not complete. Each answer opened into another uncertainty. So he walked. Villages appeared and faded behind him like half-remembered dreams. Some nights were spent beneath temple roofs, others under open sky. Elders spoke kindly to him, offering tea, offering silence, offering riddles shaped like kindness. He bowed in gratitude, listened carefully, and continued on. The path was always there, winding, splitting, narrowing, widening, yet never arriving. At times he walked faster, believing effort would reveal direction. At other times he slowed, fearing that haste was the obstacle. Still, the same quiet unease followed him like a shadow that lengthened at dusk. One evening, as the light thinned and the sky softened into gray-blue layers, the student reached a place where the path divided into three. One branch curved toward the mountains, another descended into forest, and the third nearly vanished beneath tall reeds. He stood there for a long time. The air was cool. The smell of damp earth rose gently with the evening breath of the land. No sign marked the branches. No sound suggested the correct way. The student felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the weight of choosing incorrectly, the fear of wasting time, the urgency of movement. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Nothing changed. At last, he chose the forest path and continued walking until night gathered fully around him. His steps slowed as fatigue spread through his legs and into his thoughts. When the trees grew dense and the darkness deepened, he realized he could no longer see the path clearly. Still, he walked. A root caught his foot, and he stumbled, catching himself just before falling. His breath quickened, his heartbeat louder in the quiet. For the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in many days, he stopped, not to choose, not to think, not to plan. He simply stopped. The forest did not react. Leaves did not shift. The night did not speak. Yet, in the stillness, something subtle occurred. The ache in his legs became noticeable. The shallow pattern of his breathing revealed itself. The constant pull toward forward motion loosened slightly, like a hand unclenching without instruction. He sat down on a fallen log. The bark was cool beneath his fingers. Somewhere nearby, an insect called once, then again, then fell silent. The student felt the weight of the satchel on his back and gently removed it, placing it beside him. For For the first time in a long while, nothing was being pursued. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer. Thoughts continued to arise, but without urgency. Memories of teachers, warnings about stagnation, imagined futures, they drifted through his awareness like clouds that no longer demanded direction. His breathing slowed. The forest, once obscure, became textured. The darkness held depth rather than threat. The student noticed that the ground beneath his feet had always been supporting him, even while he doubted his steps. A realization did not arrive suddenly. There was no clarity, like a bell struck sharply. Instead, there was rest, and within that rest, a quiet recognition began to form, not as words, but as sensation. The constant searching had not been guided by direction, but by fear of stopping. The movement itself had become the refuge, and exhaustion its consequence. The student remained seated as the night deepened. When he finally lay down to sleep, the earth felt firm and forgiving beneath him. His dreams were simple and without pursuit. At dawn, light filtered through the leaves in thin golden lines. Mist hovered low, softening edges. The student woke slowly, without urgency. His body felt heavy but steady. His mind, though still imperfect, was quieter. When he stood, he noticed something he had not seen the night before. Just a few steps ahead, where fallen leaves had thinned, the path continued, not branching, not hidden, but clear. It had always been there, waiting not for effort, but for stillness. The student did not smile. He did not hurry. He simply followed, rested, unburdened, and no longer searching for a rival. Morning moved gently through the forest, as if careful not to disturb what had rested there overnight. Light settled on leaves, on stone, on the quiet space between branches. The student stood for a moment, without moving, not out of hesitation, but because movement no longer felt urgent. The path ahead was narrow and unremarkable. No sign announced it. No feeling of certainty rose to meet it. Yet, it was there, visible, steady, unafraid of being questioned. He followed it slowly. The forest thinned as the ground leveled, and before long, the path opened into a clearing. At its center stood a small shelter made of wood darkened by time. Smoke rose faintly from one side, not in a way that called attention, but in the way warmth simply exists when it is needed. An old man sat nearby, mending something with careful hands. His movements were unhurried. He did not look up when the student arrived, nor did he acknowledge the sound of footsteps. The student stopped a few paces away, unsure whether to speak. Silence remained. The student waited for instruction, for recognition, for some sign that this meeting mattered. None came. The old man continued his work, thread passing through cloth resting easily in his lap. Eventually, the student sat down on the ground. Time passed without measure. The student noticed the smell of smoke, the softness of the earth beneath him, the subtle rhythm of his own breathing. Thoughts arose, questions he had carried for a long time, but without the pressure to release them immediately. At last, the old man spoke, not looking up. "You walked far," he said. The student nodded, though the gesture felt unnecessary. "Yes." Another pause followed. "You must be tired." "Yes," the student said again, more quietly this time. The old man set the cloth aside and stood. He poured water into a small cup and handed it to the student without ceremony. The cup was warm, the water plain. The student accepted it and drank. Nothing more was said. They sat together as the morning moved forward. The student expected questions, about his journey, his teachers, his intentions. But none came. The absence of inquiry felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. For so long, progress had been measured by explanation, by effort, by movement toward something. Here, nothing was required. Eventually, the student spoke, words escaping before they could be shaped carefully. "There are too many paths," he said. "Each time one seems right, it changes. Each time I stop, fear follows." The old man listened without interruption. "When you stop," he asked gently, "what are you afraid will happen?" The student searched for an answer. Images arose, of being left behind, of missing something essential, of becoming lost beyond repair. But none of them felt solid when spoken aloud. "I don't know," he said. The old man nodded, as if this were enough. "Most people don't," he replied. "They just keep walking so they don't have to notice." The words settled quietly. The student felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, more like permission. Permission to not know. Permission to remain where understanding had not yet formed. The old man stood again and gestured toward the clearing. "Stay," he said, "not forever, just until you no longer feel pulled." The student did not ask how long that would take. He stayed. Days passed without being counted. The student helped when help appeared naturally. He rested when tired. Sometimes he walked the edge of the clearing, sometimes he sat and watched light move across the ground. No lessons were given, no goals were set. Yet something shifted. The questions that once pressed urgently now arose softly, then faded. The need to choose began to feel less like responsibility and more like noise that could be set down. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the forest grew still, the student realized he was no longer waiting. He was simply there, and in that presence, a quiet understanding formed, not as thought, but as felt truth. Direction was not something missing. It was something that revealed itself when the weight of searching was released. That night, he slept without dreams. Morning arrived without announcement. No bell rang. No voice called the day into being. Light simply found its way through the trees and rested where it could. The student woke slowly, aware first of his breath, then of the quiet around him. For a moment, there was confusion, not the sharp kind, but a soft uncertainty about where he was meant to go next. Then he remembered there was nowhere he was meant to be. He sat up and listened. The clearing was still. The shelter stood as it had the day before. The old man was already awake, sweeping the ground with a broom made of thin branches. Each movement was small and unremarkable. Leaves shifted. Dust lifted and settled again. The student watched for a while, then stood and joined him. No words passed between them. The work did not feel like instruction, nor like duty. It was simply what was happening. As the morning stretched, the student became aware of something subtle. His body felt lighter, not physically, but internally, as if a constant pressure had eased. The familiar tension in his shoulders was gone. His breath moved without effort. Later, as they sat together drinking warm water, the old man spoke. "What did you leave behind when you came here?" The student considered the question. Images came to mind. Roads walked, teachers met, expectations carried, but none of them felt like the answer. "I don't know," he said at last. "I thought I left nothing, only moved forward." The old man nodded slowly. "Most people believe that," he said. "They think they are only carrying what is necessary." He picked up the student's satchel, which rested nearby, and placed it gently between them. "May I?" The student hesitated, then nodded. The old man opened the satchel. Inside were familiar things: a spare cloth, a small bowl, a few worn texts. Nothing unusual. He reached in and lifted one of the scrolls, turning it over in his hands. "You've read this many times," he said. "Yes." "And did it ever tell you when to stop?" The student frowned slightly. "No." The old man set it down and took out another. "And this one?" "No." One by one, the items were placed on the ground. With each removal, the satchel looked lighter, though its contents were unchanged. "What do you think you're carrying?" the old man asked. The student searched again. This time, his chest tightened, not with fear, but recognition. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm carrying the idea that I should already understand." The old man smiled, just barely. "Yes," he said, "that one is heavy." The words settled deeply. The student felt them not as judgment, but as relief. He had not realized how firmly he had been holding that belief. That clarity was overdue. That confusion meant failure. That rest was a delay rather than a necessity. The old man closed the satchel and returned it to the student. "You can keep walking with that weight," he said, "or you can put it down. Either way, the path will continue." That afternoon, the student walked alone along the edge of the clearing. He noticed how his steps no longer felt like proof of effort. They were simply steps. When he stopped, the ground did not disappear beneath him. He remembered all the times he had forced himself forward, afraid that pausing would undo everything he had built. Now, standing still, he saw how little had ever depended on his constant movement. At dusk, he sat on a stone and watched the sky change color. The moment felt complete without needing to lead anywhere. That night, the old man spoke again. "Tomorrow," he said, "you may leave." The student felt no rush of emotion, no fear, no urgency. "Yes," he replied. Sleep came easily. When he dreamed, it was of walking, not toward anything, but within something wide and open. Morning came, and with it, quiet readiness. The student bowed to the old man. No instructions were given, no blessings offered. As he stepped back onto the path beyond the clearing, he noticed something familiar. He was walking again, but this time, nothing was chasing him. The path beyond the clearing did not feel new. It did not feel old either. It felt ordinary. And because of that, unfamiliar. The student walked without counting his steps, without measuring progress against memory or expectation. The forest opened slowly into wide land. Hills rolled gently, their shapes softened by distance. The sky moved overhead in quiet layers of pale blue and drifting cloud. Nothing asked him to hurry. He noticed how different walking felt now. Before, each step had carried a question. Is this right? Is this enough? Am I closer? Now, the steps carried weight, but not demand. They landed, they lifted, they continued. At a bend in the path, the student passed a group of travelers resting beside the road. Their voices were low. Some spoke of where they were going. Others argued gently about which road would be faster, safer, more certain. One noticed the student and waved. "Which way leads forward?" the traveler asked. The student paused. The old reflex stirred, the urge to offer direction, to appear certain, to prove something had been learned. But the words did not form. "I don't know," he said honestly. The traveler nodded, neither disappointed nor relieved, and returned to the conversation. The student walked on. Further along, he encountered a small shrine built of stone and weathered wood. Someone had placed a bowl of water there. Leaves floated on its surface. The student knelt and looked at his reflection, not searching for insight, just noticing what was present. The face looking back was familiar, but softer. Lines of strain had eased. The eyes no longer looked ahead, as if bracing. He did not linger. As the day passed, small moments appeared and faded. A bird lifted suddenly from the grass. Wind passed over the land and moved on. Hunger arose, then settled after a simple meal. None of these moments felt like instruction, yet each one felt complete. By evening, the student reached a crossroads. 3 paths again, one narrow and shaded, one wide and open, one barely visible beneath tall growth. The sight would once have tightened his chest. Now he stood quietly. He noticed something important. The fear was gone, not replaced by confidence, not replaced by knowledge, simply absent. He sat beside the road as the light faded. The decision did not come immediately, and that felt acceptable. When he eventually stood, his body turned toward one path without explanation. There was no sense of choosing correctly, only movement arising naturally. He followed it. That night, the student slept beneath open sky. He woke once to the sound of distant wind, then returned easily to rest. Dreams did not pull him forward or backward. They passed like breath. In the morning, the path narrowed and began to climb. The land grew quiet. The student felt his muscles work, felt effort return to his body, but without the familiar strain. Effort no longer meant urgency. At the top of the rise, the path leveled and disappeared briefly into tall grass. The student slowed, not because he was unsure, but because he was attentive. He noticed how the ground pressed gently against his feet, how balance adjusted itself without thought. Even when the path faded from sight, something steady remained. He remembered the old man's words, "Stay until you no longer feel pulled." The student realized the pulling had not returned. By midday, he reached a simple village. Children ran past him laughing. Someone was repairing a roof. A woman drew water from a well. Life continued without noticing his arrival. He stood at the edge of the village and felt no need to enter or avoid it. Either felt possible. For the first time, the student understood something without forming it into thought. Direction was not a thing to be found. It was a relationship between attention and trust, between movement and rest. And that relationship was alive, moment by moment. As the sun moved west, the student stepped forward again, not because the path demanded it, but because walking now felt like listening. The village did not announce itself as important. It simply existed. The student moved through it slowly, neither avoiding nor seeking connection. People passed close, then farther away. Some noticed him. Most did not. He felt no need to explain himself. A child ran past and nearly collided with him, stopping just in time. They looked up, wide-eyed, then laughed and ran on. The sound lingered briefly, then dissolved into the air. The student continued. He noticed how often, in the past, moments like this had pulled him inward, asking whether he belonged, whether he should stay, whether leaving too soon meant missing something essential. Now, the questions did not arise. The moment arrived. The moment passed. That was enough. Near the edge of the village, he found a place to sit beneath a tree. Its branches stretched outward, unevenly, shaped by years of wind and sunlight. Some limbs were strong, others thin. None seemed to apologize for their direction. He rested there. Time slowed without effort. The student noticed hunger when it appeared. He ate simply. He noticed fatigue later. He lay down in the shade and allowed his body to sleep lightly. When he woke, nothing had changed, and that felt deeply reassuring. In the late afternoon, an older woman approached, carrying a basket. She stopped nearby and looked at him for a moment. "You're not from here," she said. "No," the student replied. "You staying?" "I don't know." She nodded, as if this answer fit perfectly into the shape of the day. "There's water by the well," she said, then continued on. The exchange ended there. The student felt a small smile move through him, not of amusement, but of recognition. Once, not knowing would have felt like failure. Now, it felt like space. As evening approached, he walked again. The path beyond the village was quiet, bordered by fields that breathed slowly in the cooling air. Crickets began their steady song. The sky softened into deeper tones. At a bend, the student stopped, not because he was uncertain, but because something had shifted. For the first time, there was no internal voice measuring whether this moment was being used well. No sense of falling behind, no need to check whether progress was being made. There was simply standing. The student realized how much of his life had been lived inside invisible decisions, every step judged, every pause justified, every rest earned. Now, rest appeared without explanation. He sat on a low stone and watched the light fade. The day felt complete, without summary. Nothing needed to be carried forward except what remained naturally. When darkness arrived fully, the student lay beneath the open sky. Stars appeared one by one, unhurried. He did not name them. He did not wonder what they meant. Sleep came easily. In his dreams, he was walking again, but not toward anything. The ground supported him. The horizon did not pull. There was movement without pressure, direction without demand. When he woke before dawn, the world felt quietly alive. Mist hovered low over the fields. The air was cool and clean. He breathed deeply without trying to calm himself. Standing, he felt something settle fully inside him. Life was no longer asking to be solved. There would be choices again. There would be confusion. There would be moments when rest would feel difficult to allow. But none of that needed to be anticipated. For now, there was only this step. The student adjusted the strap of his satchel. Lighter now, not because anything had been removed, but because nothing unnecessary was being held. He stepped forward as the light slowly returned to the land, and the path, quiet and unforced, continued to meet him. Morning unfolded slowly, as if the light itself were learning how to arrive without haste. The student walked while the world was still quiet, when even sound seemed unsure whether to exist. His steps pressed gently into the earth and lifted again, leaving only faint impressions that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. He began to notice something he had never paid attention to before. Not the steps themselves, but the space between them. There was a brief moment, barely perceptible, when one foot left the ground and the other had not yet arrived. A moment of suspension, weightless, unclaimed by forward or backward motion. At first, it felt insignificant, but as the student continued, that small pause began to stand out, like silence between notes of music. Without it, the movement would collapse into noise. He slowed. Each step became deliberate, not forced, simply noticed. The pause between movements expanded just enough to be felt. In that space, there was no direction, no effort. no correction, only balance. The student realized how rarely he had allowed such pauses in his life. Even when resting, his mind had been moving, replaying, anticipating, measuring. True pause had felt dangerous, like a gap where something might go wrong. Now, standing between steps, nothing went wrong. The land changed gradually as he walked. Fields gave way to low hills. Trees thinned, then gathered again in loose clusters. The path narrowed and widened without warning. Sometimes it disappeared briefly, then returned. Each time it vanished, the student stopped, not from fear, but from attention. He waited, not for certainty, but for the next step to become clear on its own. Sometimes it did quickly. Other times it took longer. In both cases, the waiting felt complete rather than empty. At midday, he reached a shallow stream. Water moved over smooth stones, neither rushing nor lingering. The student sat at its edge and watched. The water did not hesitate before flowing around obstacles. It did not prepare. It did not resist. It responded moment by moment, guided by what was directly in front of it. The student saw himself reflected in the surface, not clearly, but enough. The face looking back seemed less defined than before, as if the need to be someone specific had softened. He drank from the stream and rested. As he sat there, a thought arose, quiet, uninsistent. What if the path isn't ahead at all? The thought did not demand an answer. It simply passed through, leaving a subtle openness behind. The student noticed how different this felt from the questions he once carried. Sharp, urgent, heavy. This question weighed nothing. Later, as the afternoon leaned toward evening, the student walked again. He encountered another traveler moving in the opposite direction. They slowed as they passed, offering a brief nod. "Is this the right way?" the traveler asked. The student looked at the path, then at the land around it. "It's a way," he said. The traveler considered this, then smiled faintly and continued on. The exchange felt complete, even unfinished. As the sky darkened, the student found a place to rest beneath a wide tree. He lay on his back and watched branches sway gently above him. Gaps between leaves revealed patches of sky, then hid them again. He noticed how the movement of the branches mirrored his walking, motion held together by stillness. Sleep came slowly, like a tide rising without announcement. In the night, the student woke briefly. There was no reason for it, no sound that demanded attention. He lay still, noticing the darkness, the quiet pulse of his breath, the steady presence of the ground beneath him. Between one breath and the next, there was a pause. It was the same pause he had felt between steps, unoccupied, unafraid. He understood then, not with words, but with a deep settling, that this space was always available, between thoughts, between decisions, between moments of effort. It did not need to be created, only noticed. When morning came, the student rose without urgency. He did not feel closer to an ending, nor concerned about how far he had come. He simply stepped forward, and between that step and the next, he rested fully, quietly, in the space that had always been carrying him. The path moved gently downward, as if easing the body back into the world after a long climb. The student followed it without effort. His feet knew where to land. His breath found its own pace. There was no sense of arriving anywhere, and for the first time, that absence felt complete. As he walked, he noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The question that had once followed every step was no longer there, not answered, not resolved, simply absent. For a long time, the question had shaped his movement. What am I meant to do? Where is this leading? Even when unspoken, it had been present, pressing lightly but constantly against his awareness. Now, there was only walking. At first, this felt strange. Without the question, the path seemed wider, less defined. The student wondered briefly if he should be concerned. The thought passed quickly, leaving no trace. He crossed a low bridge where water flowed quietly beneath wooden planks. He paused in the middle, not to think, but to listen. The sound of water did not suggest meaning. It did not ask to be understood. It moved because moving was its nature. The student continued. Near midday, clouds gathered and released a light rain. It fell without urgency, cooling the air and darkening the earth. The student did not hurry for shelter. He felt the rain soak into his clothes, into his hair, into the ground beneath him. There was no resistance. He realized how often he had treated discomfort as interruption, something to avoid or overcome quickly. Now, it was simply part of what was happening. The rain did not delay him. It walked with him. When the rain passed, the world felt washed and quiet. The student sat on a stone to rest. His body responded naturally, easing into stillness. He noticed how rest no longer felt like stopping progress. Progress had lost its sharp edges. As he sat, a memory arose, not of a place or person, but of a time when he had believed that clarity would arrive all at once, like a door opening. He remembered how tightly he had waited for that moment, how he had measured himself against it. The memory faded gently. The student stood again and walked until evening. He passed no one for a long time. The land grew open and wide. The horizon stretched without invitation. At dusk, he felt tired and lay down where he was. The ground accepted him without question. He watched the sky dim, colors dissolving into one another. A thought appeared, soft and almost curious. If there is no question, what remains? The student did not try to answer. He lay still and allowed the thought to dissolve on its own, like a breath leaving the body. What remained was not emptiness, but presence, full, quiet, sufficient. In the night, he dreamed of standing still while the world moved around him. Paths formed and disappeared. Doors opened and closed. None required response. When he woke before dawn, the air was cool and still. The student sat up and felt something settle deeply within him. Life was not asking him anything. This realization did not make him passive. It did not make him detached. It made him available. Available to what was here. Available to the next step when it arrived. Available to rest when rest appeared. As the first light touched the land, the student stood and walked again. The path met him as it always had, quietly, without instruction, and without the question. Walking felt like listening. The day began without intention. There was no sense of beginning at all. Only light slowly touching the land, as if testing whether it was welcome. The student woke when his body was ready. He did not check the sky for signs. He did not ask how the day should be used. He simply stood and stretched, feeling the quiet strength in his limbs. Walking resumed, but without destination. The path curved gently through open ground where grasses moved in soft waves. The student noticed how easily his attention settled now. It did not jump ahead. It did not trail behind. It rested where his feet met the earth. At some point, he realized that nothing was missing from the day. This surprised him. For most of his life, days had carried a subtle lack, something undone, unresolved, postponed. Even peaceful moments had felt incomplete, measured against what should come next. This day asked for nothing. He passed a small farmhouse where smoke rose from a chimney. Someone inside was preparing a meal. The scent drifted briefly into the open air, then faded. The student did not feel drawn to it, nor did he resist it. The moment arrived and passed without friction. Further on, he encountered a man repairing a fence. The man glanced up, nodded once, and returned to his work. No exchange followed. The simplicity of it stayed with the student longer than words would have. As the sun climbed higher, warmth settled over the land. The student found shade beneath a tree and sat down. He drank water slowly, noticing how thirst eased without gratitude or commentary. The body knew what to do. He lay back and watched clouds move. They formed briefly, then shifted, then dissolved. None of them tried to become anything lasting. The student felt a deep familiarity in this movement. He remembered how he once believed that peace would come only after understanding everything, after arranging life into something clear and stable. Now, watching the clouds, he saw how stability had never meant stillness. It meant trust in movement. At midday, hunger returned. The student ate what he had. The act was quiet and unremarkable. There was no sense of reward or discipline, only nourishment. Later, he walked again. The path narrowed, then widened. At one point, it vanished into bare ground. The student slowed, then stopped. He did not search for markers. He stood, attentive. After a short while, the direction became obvious, not as certainty, but as ease. He stepped forward and continued. The sun began its descent. Shadows lengthened. The student felt the day softening, as if preparing to release itself. He found a place to rest near a low rise and sat, knees drawn close, breath steady. A thought appeared, gentle and without urgency. Nothing needs to be added to this. The student felt how true this was, not as belief, but as experience. The day did not need meaning. It did not need to teach him anything. It had already given what it could by simply being lived. As darkness approached, the student lay down. The sky dimmed gradually without drama. Stars emerged one by one. The student watched without naming them. Sleep arrived easily. In the night, there were no dreams that pulled him forward or backward. Rest was deep and even, like a body finally trusting the ground. When morning came again, the student woke with the quiet sense that this, too, would be enough. He stood and stepped onto the path, not because the day demanded movement, not because he feared staying, but because walking now felt like a natural continuation of stillness. The morning air was cool and clear, carrying the faint scent of earth warmed by the day before. The student walked as the light strengthened, noticing how naturally the body adjusted to the slope of the land. There was no effort in keeping balance. It happened on its own, quietly, without instruction. He felt complete, not in the sense of having achieved something, but in the absence of wanting the moment to be different. This feeling did not announce itself. It did not insist on being noticed. It simply rested beneath experience, steady and unchanging, like ground beneath grass. As the student walked, he remembered how often he had searched for this feeling, naming it peace, clarity, arrival. He had expected it to come with certainty, with understanding that could be carried forward. But now he saw how it did not move at all. It remained. He reached a small rise where the land opened into a wide view. Fields stretched outward, dotted with stones and low trees. In the distance, a road curved gently, then disappeared. The student stopped and stood there for a long while. Nothing in the view asked to be interpreted. A breeze passed through, lifting the hem of his clothing, then moving on. The student noticed how sensation arrived and left without effort. Sound, touch, breath. Each appeared, then faded, leaving no trace behind. And yet, something stayed. He tried briefly to locate it. Was it in the body, in the mind, in the stillness between thoughts? The attempt felt unnecessary almost immediately. Whatever remained did not need to be found. It was already present, aware of the searching and the letting go alike. The student felt a gentle smile form, not from happiness, but from recognition. He continued walking. Later that day, he encountered a small group of people resting by the side of the road. They were sharing food and quiet conversation. One of them looked up and gestured toward an empty space. "Sit," the man said simply. The student joined them. No questions were asked. He accepted a piece of bread and ate slowly. The food tasted plain and sufficient. He felt no urge to explain where he had been or where he was going. After a while, one of the women spoke. "I never know if I'm doing the right thing," she said, not to the student specifically, but into the shared space. "Even when I rest, I worry I should be moving." The words hovered gently. The student listened. He felt the familiar shape of that worry. Once sharp, now distant. After a pause, he said, "Sometimes rest is what lets the next step find you." The woman nodded, as if this confirmed something she already sensed. No further discussion followed. When the group moved on, the student remained seated for a few moments longer. He noticed how easily connection had occurred and how easily it ended. There was no sense of loss. Walking resumed. As afternoon softened toward evening, the student felt a quiet gratitude, not directed at anything in particular. It was gratitude without object, like warmth spreading without source. He realized then that what remained when nothing was missing was not an answer. It was openness, openness to movement, openness to stillness, openness to not knowing. This openness did not need protection. It was not fragile. It did not depend on conditions being calm or clear. It was present even now, as the path curved again and the land changed shape beneath his feet. At dusk, the student rested beside the road. The sky dimmed slowly, colors fading into one another. He felt the day settle naturally, without review or summary. As darkness arrived, he lay down and closed his eyes. Breath moved in, breath moved out. Between them, the same quiet presence remained, unchanged by effort, untouched by rest. The student understood, not as thought, but as living experience, that this was what had been sought all along, not direction, not certainty, not arrival, but the simple knowing that whatever came next could be met. And with that knowing, sleep arrived gently, carrying nothing forward and leaving nothing behind. The land ahead grew quiet in a different way, not empty, not distant, simply still. The path no longer curved or rose or narrowed. It stretched forward with such subtlety that it was almost indistinguishable from the ground around it. The student walked, then slowed. Something in the body recognized this place before the mind did. The familiar rhythm of movement softened, as if the next step were optional rather than required. He stopped without deciding to stop. The path did not react. Wind passed lightly over the open ground. Grass bent, then returned to itself. The sky rested wide and untroubled above. Nothing urged him forward. Nothing suggested turning back. For a long time, the student stood there. He noticed how often, in the past, stopping had felt like failure, as if motion were proof of sincerity, effort proof of worth. Now, standing still felt neither right nor wrong. It simply felt complete. He sat down on the earth. The ground was firm and patient. The student placed his hands on his knees and allowed his breathing to find its own pace. Thoughts arose slowly, like clouds drifting through a wide sky, then passed without leaving marks behind. A realization formed quietly, without words. The path had not disappeared. It had stopped asking to be followed. This understanding did not feel dramatic. There was no sense of arrival or ending. It felt more like noticing something that had always been present, but rarely allowed. The student remembered how often he had treated life as a sequence, one step justified by the next, one moment valuable only because it led somewhere else. Sitting here, with no movement demanded, he saw how that habit had shaped his restlessness. Now, with the path unmoving, there was nothing to chase. Time loosened its grip. The student could not say how long he sat. The sun moved slowly across the sky, but without pulling him along with it. Hunger appeared briefly, then faded. Sensation shifted, then settled. At one point, a traveler passed in the distance, walking steadily along another road. The student watched without comparison. The sight stirred no longing, no judgment. Movement could happen. Stillness could happen. Neither held authority. As the day leaned toward afternoon, the student stood again. He took a few steps forward, then stopped once more. Each movement felt complete on its own, no longer part of a larger effort. He understood then, not as belief, but as lived truth, that the path did not exist to be completed. It existed to be met. Sometimes through walking, sometimes through resting, sometimes through standing still, long enough to feel the ground supporting everything. The student lay down on the earth and closed his eyes. Sound softened. Breath deepened. Awareness remained open, without direction. There was no sense of losing time, no fear of falling behind, only presence, steady and sufficient. When he rose later, the light had changed. Shadows lengthened gently across the land. The student felt no urgency to decide where to sleep or how far to go. He took a few steps, then another, then rested again. The path remained exactly as it was, neither advancing nor retreating. And for the first time, the student understood something subtle and freeing. The path was not something outside of him. It was the quiet agreement between movement and rest, between listening and responding, between trusting and allowing. As evening settled, the student walked slowly, without expectation. The land accepted each step. The stillness followed him, not as absence, but as companionship. And wherever he stopped, the path was already there. The evening air cooled gradually, carrying with it the soft scent of grass and distant water. The student walked as night gathered, not because he was heading somewhere, but because movement now felt like a gentle expression of listening. Each step rose from stillness and returned to it, like a wave lifting from the surface of a quiet lake and settling back again. He noticed something subtle and unexpected. Stillness had not remained behind when he began to walk. It moved with him. This realization did not arrive as a thought. It was felt, in the way his breath remained deep even while his legs worked, in the way attention stayed open without needing to narrow around direction or outcome. Walking no longer pulled him away from rest. It carried rest within it. The student passed through a narrow valley where the sound of his steps echoed briefly against stone, then faded. He listened to the echo without waiting for it to return. The moment completed itself naturally. In the past, such places had stirred reflection. He would have asked what the echo meant, or whether the valley symbolized something important. Now, the mind remained quiet. The sound had been heard. That was enough. As darkness deepened, the student found a place to sleep beneath a wide sky. He lay on his back and watched the stars appear slowly, one by one, without urgency. The vastness above did not make him feel small. It made him feel included. Sleep came easily, but not heavily. During the night, he woke briefly and noticed the steady rhythm of his breath, the cool air against his skin, the firm presence of the ground. There was no need to change position, no need to improve the moment. Stillness was already present. In the morning, he rose and walked again. The land ahead was unfamiliar, yet there was no sense of entering something new. The student noticed how easily attention adjusted to change now. A shift in terrain, a bend in the path, the appearance of distant hills. Change no longer demanded preparation. He encountered a small stream and crossed it carefully, feeling the cool water touch his ankles. For a moment, he stood in the stream, neither crossing nor returning. The water moved around him, indifferent and accommodating. He smiled softly. Before, he would have rushed to the other side, anxious to continue. Now, standing in the moving water, felt complete. Movement and stillness were no longer opposing forces. They existed together, each supporting the other. Later that day, the student passed through a grove of trees where light filtered gently through leaves. Patterns formed on the ground, then dissolved as the wind shifted the branches. He slowed his pace, allowing the body to adjust naturally. He noticed how the mind no longer rushed ahead to label experience. It rested within it. Sensation, sound, and sight arose and passed without being held. At one point, the student stopped and turned in a slow circle, taking in the landscape. Not to remember it, not to compare it, simply to see. The land did not change under his gaze. What changed was the absence of separation. He understood then that stillness was not the absence of movement. It was the absence of resistance to movement. When nothing was being pushed away or pulled toward, everything could move freely. This understanding settled deeply, without excitement. In the late afternoon, the student met an old shepherd, guiding a small group of animals along the edge of the path. They paused briefly as they passed one another. "You walk calmly," the shepherd said. The student nodded. "Where are you headed?" The question felt light, almost playful. "I'm walking," the student replied. The shepherd smiled and continued on. The exchange lingered, not because it revealed something new, but because it reflected something already known. Walking did not need justification. It was complete as it was. As evening approached again, the student felt a deep, steady ease settle through him. The sense of effort that once accompanied every choice had softened into trust. He did not need to anticipate what the next day would bring. Stillness would be there. Movement would be there. Neither would cancel the other. When night came, the student rested without thinking of rest. When sleep arrived, it did so naturally, like a hand settling gently on the shoulder of the body. And in sleep, as in waking, stillness walked with him, not as something achieved, but as something remembered. The morning arrived quietly. as if aware that nothing needed to be announced. The student woke before the light fully settled, not from intention, but from a gentle readiness in the body. He sat for a moment, feeling the steady rhythm of breath and the calm weight of being awake. There was no question waiting for him. This felt new. For so long, mornings had carried an invisible demand to decide, to plan, to understand. Even when the day began softly, something inside had been reaching ahead, searching for meaning before the first step was taken. Now, the reaching was absent. The student stood and walked as the light slowly spread across the land. The path moved through open ground, unremarkable and wide. Each step felt complete, not because it led somewhere, but because it landed fully where it was. As he walked, a familiar thought arose, not sharply, but gently, like an old habit remembering itself. What is all of this for? The thought appeared clearly, then stopped. It did not demand an answer. The student noticed the space that followed. There was no rush to fill it, no tightening in the chest, no need to search inward. The question rested, unanswered, and somehow that was enough. He continued walking. At the edge of the path, he saw an old stone marker half buried in the earth. Time had worn away any writing that might once have been there. The student paused beside it, touching the cool surface with his hand. If the marker had once pointed somewhere, it no longer did. Yet the path continued. He felt a quiet recognition move through him. Answers, like markers, belonged to a moment. They served for a time, then faded. What remained was the walking itself. Later in the day, the student encountered a small group gathered beneath a tree. They were speaking softly, their faces attentive, as if listening to something important. When the student drew closer, he realized no one was speaking at all. They were simply sitting together. One person noticed him and gestured for him to join. The student sat down among them. No explanation followed. No teaching was offered. They remained there, sharing shade, breath, and time. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. The student felt the familiar impulse to ask something, to make use of the moment, to draw meaning from it. The impulse softened and passed, leaving only presence behind. In that shared silence, something subtle occurred. The sense of needing to understand dissolved completely. There was no clarity in the way he once imagined clarity, no insight that could be carried or explained. Instead, there was a quiet alignment, like something settling back into its natural place. The student realized then that answers had never been what he was searching for. He had been searching for relief from the asking. When the group eventually stood and moved on, the student remained seated for a while longer. The space felt full without words. When he rose and returned to the path, the day continued without interruption. As afternoon gave way to evening, the student walked until fatigue appeared naturally. He rested when it did, without judgment. Hunger came and went. The body spoke. He listened. That night, lying beneath the open sky, he noticed how thoughts still arose, memories, images, fragments of old questions. But they no longer organized themselves around a center. They drifted through awareness without forming a story. Between one thought and the next, there was quiet. In that quiet, there was no answer and no lack. The student felt a deep ease settle through him, not the kind that comes from resolution, but the kind that comes from trust. Trust that life did not require constant explanation. Trust that understanding could exist without words. Sleep arrived gently. In the morning, when the student rose again, the path was there as always. He stepped onto it without expectation. The answer that did not speak walked with him, invisible, complete, and no longer needing to be found. The path curved gently and began to feel familiar, though the student could not say why. The land did not repeat itself in any obvious way. The trees were different. The slope of the ground shifted subtly, and yet something beneath the surface felt unchanged, like a melody returning in a different key. He walked without trying to recognize it. The sense of familiarity did not pull him backward. It did not suggest memory or nostalgia. It felt quieter than that, like the body remembering how to breathe after a long rest. As the day unfolded, the student noticed small details with increasing clarity. The way stones gathered naturally at the edge of the path, the way birds paused mid-flight, then continued, the way shadows formed and dissolved without hesitation. None of it asked to be held. By midday, the student reached a low ridge and stopped. Below him lay a wide plain, open and still. A single road cut through it, straight and unadorned, disappearing into distance. He felt no urge to follow it immediately. Instead, he sat. As he rested, a memory surfaced, not of a place, but of a feeling he had known long ago, before questions had sharpened and effort had become habit. It was the feeling of being present without needing to justify presence. The memory did not bring emotion, it brought recognition. He realized then that the place he was moving toward was not ahead or behind. It was the quality of attention he carried. Wherever that attention rested without resistance, the place appeared. The student stood and walked again. Later, he passed a small settlement built around a well. People moved quietly, engaged in ordinary tasks, drawing water, mending cloth, sitting in shade. The student walked through without drawing notice, yet felt no separation. For the first time, he noticed that the world no longer appeared fragmented. Actions did not stand apart from stillness. Sound did not interrupt silence. Everything seemed to belong to the same continuous movement. He stopped near the well and watched water rise, spill, return to the ground. No one commented. No one waited for him to leave. The student understood something gently. The place that did not change was not a destination. It was the ground of experience itself. No matter how far he walked, this ground remained. When he was restless, it was covered by noise. When he was quiet, it revealed itself naturally. As evening approached, the student left the settlement and followed the road for a while. His steps were steady, his breathing even. There was no sense of returning, though something felt deeply settled. At dusk, he reached a familiar kind of stillness. Not dramatic, not deep, simply present. He lay down beneath the open sky and watched the light fade. Stars appeared slowly, the same stars that had appeared nights before. Yet, the student did not feel repetition. Each appearance felt new because nothing was being compared. He slept deeply. When he woke in the night, there was no disorientation. Darkness felt spacious rather than empty. He listened to the subtle sounds of the land and felt himself as part of them. Before returning to sleep, a simple understanding arose, not as a thought, but as a settled knowing. Nothing essential had ever been missing. Nothing essential could be lost. The student slept again. In the morning, he rose and walked without expectation. The path was there as it always had been. The place that did not change moved with him, not as something he carried, but as something that carried him. The day unfolded without edges. There was no clear beginning to it, and no sense that it needed one. Light arrived, sound followed, breath continued. The student walked, but the word journey no longer carried weight. Movement had softened into presence. He noticed how rarely the mind now reached forward. The habit had not disappeared completely, but it no longer ruled the body. When anticipation arose, it dissolved before forming direction. When memory surfaced, it passed without drawing him back. The student realized that the journey itself had grown quiet, not ended, not completed, simply no longer speaking. The land reflected this change. The path remained, yet it no longer seemed to lead anywhere in particular. Hills rose and fell gently. Trees appeared and receded. The world felt less like a sequence and more like a single, continuous field. At one point, the student stopped beside a wide, shallow lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky without distortion. He sat at its edge and watched his reflection form, blur, then settle again. He did not look away. Once, seeing his own reflection would have stirred thought. Who am I now? How have I changed? Now, the reflection appeared and vanished without meaning. He stayed there for a long while. A bird skimmed the surface of the lake, leaving brief ripples that spread and disappeared. The water returned to stillness without effort. The student felt the same quiet return within himself. He stood and walked again. As the afternoon passed, the student encountered fewer people. The land opened wide, offering nothing to interpret. There were no signs, no markers, no need for reassurance. The path continued because walking continued. That was all. He noticed how often effort had once been tangled with identity, how walking had meant becoming someone, reaching something, proving something. Now, walking was simply what happened when the body moved forward. Nothing was being built. Toward evening, the student felt fatigue and rested beneath a tree. He lay on the ground, eyes open, watching branches sway gently above him. Leaves moved, light shifted, sound drifted through and away. The world felt intimate without being personal. As darkness approached, the student sensed a subtle change, not in the land, but in his relationship to it. The idea of going somewhere no longer framed experience. Even rest no longer felt like preparation for what came next. Everything felt sufficient as it was. That night, sleep came slowly and lightly. The student drifted in and out, aware of breath, aware of darkness, aware of presence. There were no dreams of movement or destination, only quiet awareness, steady and wide. When he woke before dawn, the sky was just beginning to lighten. The student sat up and felt a gentle completeness settle through him. The journey had not ended. It had simply stopped asking to be followed. When he stood and walked again, there was no sense of continuing something. The step rose naturally, touched the ground, and passed. Another followed. Between them, stillness remained. The student walked into the light without thought of distance or time. The journey grew quieter with each step, not because it was fading, but because nothing remained that needed to be said. And in that quiet, the path continued, unchanged and unclaimed. The light of early morning rested gently on the land, not yet bright enough to define edges. The student stood still for a long moment, feeling how naturally stillness now preceded movement. There was no anticipation of where the next step would lead. The body simply waited, untroubled. He began to sense something subtle, not ahead of him, not behind him, but beneath all motion. Before walking had become a habit, before searching had shaped his days, before even the idea of a path had formed, there had been something else. The student did not try to name it. Naming would have pulled it into thought, and thought was no longer needed here. Instead, he allowed attention to soften, to widen, to settle back into what was already present. He noticed how awareness remained unchanged, whether he walked or stood still, whether sound arose or faded, whether the mind was quiet or briefly stirred. This presence did not move with the body, yet it was never separate from it. He walked slowly, almost reverently, as if movement itself were an expression of listening. The path passed through a stretch of open ground where nothing marked direction. The student felt no uncertainty. His steps did not search for confirmation. They landed and lifted, complete in themselves. He remembered how once he had believed that meaning came from accumulation, experiences gathered, lessons learned, distance traveled. Now, standing within this quiet awareness, he saw how meaning had never depended on addition. It had been here before the first step was taken. As the day unfolded, the student encountered ordinary moments: thirst, warmth, a brief ache in the legs. Each arose naturally and passed without resistance. None of them disturbed the underlying stillness. At midday, he rested beneath a low sky and closed his eyes. Thoughts drifted briefly, then thinned. What remained was not blankness, but presence, steady, aware, unchanging. He realized then that this presence had accompanied him through every stage of the journey. It had been there when he was restless. It had been there when he doubted. It had been there even when he believed he was lost. It had never left. The student felt a deep tenderness arise, not toward himself as a person, but toward the long effort that had never been necessary, toward the searching that had been sincere, yet guided by misunderstanding. There was no regret, only understanding. When he opened his eyes, the land appeared the same, yet the way it was seen had softened. There was no separation between observer and observed. Sound and silence belonged equally. Movement and rest were expressions of the same ground. The student stood and walked again. But now, walking felt secondary. It was something that happened within awareness, not something that defined it. As evening approached, the sky grew pale and wide. The student sat and watched light fade without tracing its meaning. There was nothing to extract from the moment, nothing to carry forward. He sensed clearly now that whatever he had been seeking through distance and direction had never been distant at all. It had been present before the journey began, present during every step, present even now, as nothing needed to happen. When night came, the student lay down gently. Sleep arrived without resistance, like a natural deepening of rest. There were no dreams that carried him away. Awareness remained soft and steady, even as the body slept. In the quiet of the night, without words or images, something was remembered. Not a truth, not a teaching, but a simple fact of being. What had been there before the first step had never moved, and because it had never moved, it could never be lost. Morning came without contrast. Light did not break the night apart. It simply softened it. The student woke slowly, aware of the body resting on the ground, aware of breath moving without instruction. There was no sense of beginning again. He stood, not to continue, not to arrive, only because standing happened. As he walked, a feeling emerged that might once have been called returning. Yet nothing in him recognized a place to return to. The land ahead did not feel familiar in the way memory feels familiar. It felt familiar in the way breath feels familiar, always present, never owned. The path curved gently, passing through terrain that echoed earlier landscapes. Trees spaced themselves with the same quiet logic. Stones rested where stones naturally rested. The student noticed this resemblance without comparing. He realized that nothing was repeating. It was all new and all the same. As the day unfolded, he passed a small temple built into the hillside. Its doors were open. Inside, a single lamp burned steadily. The student stood at the threshold for a moment. Once, he would have entered seeking instruction, affirmation, or rest. Now, standing there, he felt no pull in either direction. Entering or continuing felt equally complete. He bowed slightly, not to the temple, not to any teaching, but to the moment itself. Then he walked on. The act felt final, without ending anything. Later, he encountered a group of travelers sitting beside the road. They spoke quietly, sharing concerns about routes, weather, and timing. One of them noticed the student and asked, "Have you been far?" The question did not land as it once would have. "I've been here," the student said gently. The traveler looked puzzled, then smiled politely. The conversation moved on. The student listened without feeling separate, without feeling required to clarify. As afternoon deepened, the student felt something integrate fully, not a realization, but a settling. The effort that had once shaped his walking had dissolved entirely. Even the idea of practice felt unnecessary. Life no longer needed to be approached. It was already present. At dusk, the student rested near a familiar-looking bend in the land. He recognized the curve, not as memory, but as pattern, the way rivers curve, the way clouds gather, the way breath turns naturally. He lay down and watched the sky dim. There was no sense of finishing anything. That night, sleep arrived gently and deeply. No images rose, no dreams formed. Awareness softened, but did not disappear. It rested, as it always had, unchanged by the body's rest. When the student woke before dawn, the air was still. The world felt intimate and wide at once. He sat quietly, feeling the simple fact of being awake. He saw clearly now that the journey had never been about leaving or returning. It had been about noticing what remained when effort fell away, noticing what did not move when movement ceased, noticing what had always been present beneath direction and doubt. As the first light touched the land, the student stood and walked once more, not because the path required it, but because walking felt like a natural expression of presence. There was no return to make. Nothing had ever been left. And with each step, the quiet understanding deepened. Not forward, not inward, but evenly, like light spreading across a room that had never been dark. The morning felt unusually light, as if the world itself had released something during the night. The student walked slowly, not because he was tired, but because speed no longer seemed relevant. Each step arose on its own and settled without leaving a trace. He noticed something else had softened, understanding itself. For a long time, even after effort had fallen away, there had still been a subtle holding, a quiet sense of knowing. It was gentle, not tight, but it was still something the mind could lean against. Now, even that was loosening. The student did not feel confused. There was no sense of loss. Instead, there was a widening, like hands opening after carrying something for too long. Nothing was being dropped. Nothing was being kept. The land reflected this ease. The path blurred slightly into the ground, no longer clearly separate. Grass leaned over stones. Dust softened edges. The distinction between where the path ended and where the earth began felt unimportant. The student walked and felt how little needed to be managed. Breath moved. Sound appeared and faded. The body adjusted to terrain without thought. At one point, a memory arose, an image of himself at the beginning of the journey, walking with urgency, eyes fixed ahead. The image felt distant, but not foreign. It belonged to the same unfolding, just shaped by a different kind of tension. There was no judgment toward it, only gentleness. He realized that seeking had never been wrong. It had simply been heavy. And now, with nothing left to hold, even seeking dissolved naturally, like mist under the morning sun. The student sat beside a low stone wall and rested his hands in his lap. There was no intention in the sitting, no practice, no observation. Awareness remained, effortless and open. Time passed without measure. The student could not say how long he sat. When he stood again, the movement happened without preparation. Later in the day, he encountered a small stream flowing quietly through reeds. He knelt and touched the water. It moved around his fingers, indifferent and free. When he lifted his hand, the water returned immediately to itself. The student felt a deep resonance with this simplicity. Nothing needed to be remembered. Nothing needed to be understood. Nothing needed to be carried forward. He saw clearly now that even wisdom, if held, became weight. When evening approached, the student lay down where he was. The sky dimmed slowly, colors fading without drama. The body rested easily. The mind did not follow thoughts into stories. Sleep came gently. During the night, the student woke briefly. There was no reason for waking. He lay still, feeling the quiet presence of being awake in darkness. No insight formed, no reflection arose, and nothing was missing. This was the deepest rest he had known. Not the rest that follows effort, but the rest that comes when effort is no longer possible, because there is nothing left to apply it to. In the early morning, he rose again. The world greeted him without greeting. Light touched the land. Sound returned softly. The student walked. But now, even walking felt unnecessary. Something happening rather than something chosen. When nothing was left to hold, what remained was not emptiness, but freedom without direction. Not peace that could be named, not clarity that could be explained. Only life, moving quietly, without asking to be followed. The morning did not arrive all at once. Light seeped gently into the world, touching the edges of things before revealing their form. The student lay still for a long time after waking, not out of hesitation, but because there was no reason to move yet. Breath came and went. The body rested on the ground. Sound drifted in and out of awareness. Nothing called for attention. When he finally stood, the movement felt almost unnecessary, like ripples forming on water that was already calm. He walked slowly, not following the path so much as moving within it, as one moves within air without thinking of direction. The stillness he had noticed before was no longer something that accompanied him. It remained. It did not deepen or fade. It did not change with movement or rest. It was simply there, open, spacious, untroubled. As the student walked, he noticed how the land itself seemed to rest inside this stillness. Hills rose without effort. Trees stood without holding themselves upright. Clouds drifted without needing to go anywhere. Nothing resisted being exactly what it was. The student felt no desire to understand this. Understanding would have been another movement, another grasp. Instead, there was quiet intimacy, a sense of belonging that did not require closeness. At some point, the path softened completely into open ground. There was no clear line to follow. Once, this would have unsettled him. Now, it barely registered. His steps adjusted naturally. He realized that orientation no longer came from the eyes or the mind. It came from something simpler, the body's ease, the absence of resistance, the quiet sense of yes that arose without explanation. He walked until walking faded into standing. He stood until standing faded into sitting. Time moved, but not in a way that carried him with it. The student sat beneath a wide sky and felt the day unfold without reference. There was no midday, no afternoon, only light changing quality, air shifting temperature, the body responding when it needed to. A memory surfaced briefly of the first days of walking, when every step had been charged with expectation. The memory passed gently, without emotion. That effort felt very far away now, not because it was rejected, but because it was no longer needed. The stillness that remained did not belong to the student. It was not his stillness. It did not come and go with mood, insight, or fatigue. It was not something he could lose or protect. It remained even when thoughts appeared, even when sensations shifted. It remained even when nothing was noticed. As evening approached, the student lay down where he was. The ground felt familiar in a way that did not depend on memory. The sky dimmed slowly. Stars appeared without announcement. He did not watch them closely. There was no sense of observation now, only presence resting within presence, like water resting within water. Sleep arrived not as a change, but as a softening. Awareness did not disappear. It thinned gently, like fog dissolving into air. In the night, there were no dreams. Or perhaps there were, but none that needed to be remembered. When the student woke again, the stillness was unchanged. Morning, night, movement, rest, all passed through it without leaving marks. The student felt no impulse to continue the journey, yet walking happened. He felt no impulse to stop, yet rest appeared naturally. This was not balance. Balance still implies adjustment. This was ease, effortless, unheld, complete. The student understood now, without forming a thought, that this stillness was what had been present from the very beginning, before the search, before the path, before the need to go anywhere at all. And because it had never moved, it would remain, not as something to return to, not as something to remember, but as the quiet ground beneath every step, whether taken or not. There was no clear moment when the path stopped mattering. No realization arrived to announce it. No threshold was crossed. It happened the way night becomes dawn, gradually, without being noticed. The student walked in the early light, though walking now felt like a simple movement within something already whole. His feet touched the earth and lifted again, but there was no sense of direction attached to them. The ground did not feel ahead or behind. It felt present everywhere. He paused often, not to rest, not to decide, but because pausing arose naturally, like a breath completing itself. The idea of path softened. Before, the path had implied distance, sequence, progress. It had suggested that something waited farther on, something not yet reached. Now, the path was no longer a line to follow. It was simply the place where the body happened to be. Sometimes it was visible. Sometimes it disappeared into grass or stone. Sometimes it did not appear at all. None of this mattered. The student noticed how easily the body adjusted without guidance. When the ground rose, the body leaned forward. When it leveled, effort eased. When rest was needed, rest happened. Nothing was being managed. The land felt intimate without closeness, wide without distance. Trees stood without framing the space. The sky stretched without asking to be looked at. Even sound felt softer, not quieter, but less insistent. At one point, the student stood for a long time without moving, not waiting, not listening for instruction, simply standing. There was no impatience, no expectation of what should follow. Standing and walking no longer opposed each other. They belonged to the same quiet movement. A memory surfaced of the first question that had sent him walking. The question felt almost unreal now, like a language no longer spoken. He did not try to recall its words. The impulse to search for meaning in that memory did not arise. He let it pass. The student realized then that meaning had never lived in movement or stillness, in paths or pauses. Meaning had lived in the struggle to secure something permanent in a world that never stopped changing. And now, without that struggle, meaning had gently stepped aside. What remained was not emptiness. What remained was intimacy with what is. As the day unfolded, the student encountered ordinary things. A fallen branch, a shallow pool of rainwater, a stretch of warm stone. Each appeared and passed without comment. There was no sense of this is important or this is not. Everything felt equally near. At midday, the student sat beneath open sky and closed his eyes. Thoughts arose briefly, like distant echoes, then dissolved. Awareness rested without center or edge. He noticed something delicate. Even the sense of being someone was thinning, not disappearing, not denied, simply no longer emphasized. There was breathing, sensing, resting, but no need to locate an identity inside these movements. Life was happening without reference. When he opened his eyes again, the world looked unchanged, but the way it was seen had softened further. The student felt no difference between being in the world and the world being in him. Toward evening, light began to fade. The student lay down where he was without choosing a place. The earth received him easily. The sky dimmed, colors dissolving into one another. Stars appeared slowly. He did not count them. He did not wonder how long he had been walking. He did not ask what remained. Sleep arrived without boundary. Awareness softened, but did not vanish, like a river slowing as it enters the sea. In the quiet of the night, without dream or thought, something settled completely. The path, once followed, once questioned, once released, was no longer relevant, not because it had ended, but because nothing needed to be carried forward anymore. When morning came again, it came gently, without name, and the student rose, or perhaps life rose through him, without knowing whether this was movement or rest. And it did not matter. Morning arrived without a beginning. Light did not separate itself from darkness. It softened it. The sky shifted gently, not from night to day, but from one shade of stillness to another. The student lay where he was, breathing slowly, aware without needing to focus. There was no sense of waking, only the easing of rest. The body felt supported by the ground, not held down, not lifted up. Breath moved in and out like a tide that had never learned to rush. Sound appeared, distant, brief, then settled back into quiet. Nothing announced itself as important. When the student stood, it was not because the day had started. Standing simply happened, like a leaf lifting slightly when the air moves beneath it. There was no intention behind the movement and no consequence following it. Walking resumed, though resumed was not the right word. Walking continued the way breathing continues. The land was familiar without being recognized. Trees stood, stones rested. The path appeared faintly in places, then disappeared again. None of this asked to be noticed. The student moved through it all without effort, without reflection. There was no memory of the journey as a story, no sense of chapters completed. What had once felt like progression now felt like a single, continuous presence unfolding in different shapes. At some point, he stopped near a low rise and looked out across the land. Mist lingered close to the ground, blurring edges, softening distance. The view did not invite interpretation. The student did not stand looking. He stood within. The sense of being a watcher dissolved gently. Seeing happened without someone seeing. Sound moved without someone listening. Breath moved without someone breathing. Life continued without reference. There was no thought of staying, no thought of leaving, no thought of understanding. The student realized, not as insight, not as conclusion, that nothing more would arrive. Nothing was missing. Nothing was on its way. This was not fulfillment. Fulfillment implies completion. This was ease. Ease without opposite. Ease without effort. Ease that had always been present, unnoticed only because it had never demanded attention. As the light strengthened, warmth spread across the land. The student felt it on the skin without naming it. Hunger did not arise. Fatigue did not arise. Time did not assert itself. Eventually, walking happened again. Or perhaps it did not. It was no longer possible to say where stillness ended and movement began. Each step was quiet, each pause complete. The distinction had lost meaning. Birds crossed the sky. Wind passed through grass. Clouds drifted and thinned. Nothing lingered. Nothing was taken. The student lay down once more, or perhaps simply rested where he stood. The body eased. Awareness softened further, like a breath exhaling without needing to inhale again. Sleep came not as a transition, but as a deepening. Thought did not follow. Images did not form. Time did not pass in any noticeable way. There was only rest, wide, gentle, unclaimed. And within that rest, life continued quietly, without direction, without effort, without name. No path, no destination, no one arriving. Only the soft presence of what had always been here, before the first step, before the search, before the need to know. And as the quiet deepened, even this softened, leaving nothing to hold and nothing to let go of. The morning remained, without name, without end.